As you know, we sent out an advertisement for any of interest to fill the vacancy for the Borough of Freehold seat on the Board of Education. We received Ms. Amanda Cobb's resume and letter of interest, and I shared that with you. And then at our reorganization meeting in January, Ms. McCobb joined the board for an interview. And now it's come time to swear Amanda McCobb in for the representative of the Borough of Freehold and to join us at the table. So, Ms. McCobb, if you could step to the microphone, please.
I, Amanda McCobb, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of New Jersey, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same and to the governments established in the United States and this state under the authority of the people, so help me God. I, Amanda McCobb, do solemnly swear that I possess the qualifications prescribed by law for the office of member of the Board of Education, and that I am not disqualified as a voter pursuant to RS 19-4-1, nor disqualified due to conviction of a crime or offense listed as in NJSA 18A 12-1, and that I will faithfully, impartially, and justly perform all the duties of that office according to the best of my ability, so help me God.
Amanda, you'd like to take the seat. Congratulations. Now we're going to have our ethics training.
Mr. Bruno?
Oh, I know you want to do the roll call. I'm sorry.
The specific area where she's
So,
smiling now.
roll call for the Board of Education. Mrs. Bruno? Mrs. Capiello?
Here.
Mrs. Finelli?
Here.
Mrs. Higley?
Here.
Mrs. Lavin?
Here.
Ms. McCobb?
Here.
Mr. Parisi?
Here.
Mr. Messenger?
Here.
Mr. Bruno?
Here. John, do you want us down there?
Mr. President, whatever would be easiest for all of you.
Okay, that means we're going to move.
Okay.
We're going to move to the seats, okay? Okay.
Should have brought popcorn. Mr. President, may I?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. President, members of the board, Dr. Sampson, Mr. Boyce. I'm John Comegno. I carry Mark Toscano's bags. I will begin by noting the most important information, what is on everyone's minds, and that is Jackson Toscano's team. He is now 2-2. A 7-0 shutout over the Austrian national team. A win over the Canadian team, which won the tournament last year. Losses to Zurich, Switzerland, and the Quebec AAA team. We're still in the exhibition phase. All looks like this is going to be a great tournament for the Hershey PA USA team. Mark sends his best. It's my privilege to be here tonight. It has been a while since I've seen you. It's been a while since we've been in the same room together. I welcome you and congratulate you to what is truly the most selfless public service that one can engage in. I would say not just in this state, but anywhere. And that is in part, folks, because of the 50 states, 50. New Jersey's ranked #1. You have been the fabric of our communities during COVID, during a time over these last 2.5 years when public education was strained, when public education had to reinvent itself. And as you will find, and as your colleagues have found, and as this board so really beautifully and professionally and collegially embodies, the role of a member of the Board of Education is not simple, and it's not easy. And it is unique amongst all other elected offices in this state. The role that you play on that stage is different than the role that folks play sitting out here in the audience. It's different. The rights that you enjoy on that stage to speech are different than the rights of individuals here at the podium. Whether or not you can ever take your hat off. How you listen to administrative recommendation. The role you play when voicing the concerns of your constituents, which the Ethics Act specifically says, you are to discern. It's not simple. But you get it. You get it in part through trainings like tonight, through the leadership of your board leadership and administration, through trainings from school boards and otherwise. Little known fact that this is actually Chuck Sampson's favorite movie. What does the brain that wouldn't die have to do with the presentation on school board ethics? It has to do with this elected official. And if you pay attention to notices, you'll see pursuant to the Byron Bayer Open Public Meetings Act, the board hereby gives notice, the OPRA, similar to the OPRA, the Open Public Records Act. The way this body conducts itself in public meetings, the fact that we have to provide voice to our community, we have to give notice that there are limits on when we sit with a quorum, which means a majority, what we say, what we don't, how we provide information to the public when we go into exec, is because of the Open Public Meetings Act, which Senator Bayer has his name on. He was the technical director for the brain that wouldn't die. That will make you very famous and important in school boards this year. When you go down to Atlantic City, you can share that bit of trivia. Let me ask you, my friends, what is a school board member's job? What's your job? Thank you. To establish policy, to oversee implementation of policy, to consider in a truly 30,000-foot way how this district honors the state, because there's no federal, state constitutional entitlement to public education for its students. What else? So let me ask you this, members of the board, you can't answer. How many employees do you have? 1,300. The district? How many employees does this board have? This board has 1 employee. I think the 2 most important things that you do is to establish policy and ensure that those policies are implemented consistently. As you're going to hear tonight, and as you've heard before, your job is not to administer the district. It is to see that it is well administered. And that is principally through the selection of your superintendent, your chief executive officer, who is the only employee that you may evaluate, who, strictly speaking, is the only employee you may speak to. Your board secretary has a role with you, but your board secretary is evaluated That's exactly right. So when we look at that pyramid, folks, your role in interacting within the district is directed to your communications with your board president, who you have elected, you've appointed, who gets double pay for it, gets double trouble for it, and communication with your superintendent. What's the purpose of a school board meeting? And I suggest to you all of these rules flow from these two questions.
My personal,
Please.
this is my 8th year. I kind of see it differently now, like when I first got on the board. It's really to oversee what business has gone on backlog. And it's not what happened prior, but like moving forward, like what's going on this month, whether we have to approve. And I don't think I ever did that when I first started.
Thank you. Approve. Your president used the word approve. I think that purpose of a school board meeting is to take action. To take action. Which means that in many ways, the conversation is governed by, limited to, regulated through our agenda. What's on the agenda, what's not on the agenda. There's an opportunity for new business. There's an opportunity certainly for discussion of agenda items. But the information that you access, how you prepare, what's being discussed here in various reports, like HIV updates, all go back to the action that you're being asked to take. The School Ethics Act gives rails for you, gives guidance for you in your operations. What you can and can't do, what you're expected to do, what you're expected not to do. And I think if we come back to the purpose of the meeting, the purpose in your role, all of these ethical tenets flow from it. The board's the governing body of the school district, charged with high-level, there's that word again, policy-making decisions. Only the entity can enter into contracts or other binding agreements. Our boards, there are over 580 in this state. And they have different memberships. Some boards are as little as 5. Some are 9, some are 7. One of our boards has 14. With weighted votes. Sean really enjoyed attending those meetings. Only the No, that district also has weighted votes. Yeah. Many regional districts do have weighted votes. Only the entity can enter into contracts or other binding agreements, and importantly, folks, only the board can take action. You're one of a collective, which again is very different than any other elected office. Assembly people, senators, council people, commissioners can speak freely on their behalf individually. They can vote on their behalf. They can submit ideas, bills on their behalf. The Board of Education acts as one of the whole. See, the Ethics Act explains for us. And only one member is authorized to speak publicly about school district business. Who is that? It's only your president, unless he designates it or delegates it otherwise. Your decision-making authority is limited in that, again, you may not administer the schools. Your job is to see that the schools are well administered. Your job is not to rubber stamp. You're not expected to say yes to every motion that is placed before you. But you only may say no if you have a bona fide, good faith reason to say no. In many situations, you can't act without the recommendation of your superintendent. Personnel matters, for example. And I ask you this question. Is there ever a time when you're not a member of Regional's Board of Education? Is there ever a time when you can take your hat off? You're on the side of the soccer field, you're on Facebook. The best advice I can give you tonight is to delete your Facebook account, actually. Never happened. Proud. Right? Can you ever take your hat off?
No.
There are very clear, thank you, rules about the statements that you can make. And this is truly America, right? We have free speech. But just as the speech rights of our employees upon hiring, just as the speech rights of our employees when they pass through the door, our students when they pass through the door, becomes attenuated and limited, yours does as well. And I would encourage you to think about what is heard, not so much what you say, because perception is reality. You may say, I am not speaking on behalf of the Freehold Regional High School District Board of Education. I think this law is whack. What gets printed in paper is, I think this law is whack. I think we ought to this or that. What gets passed along the lane. What is heard, what is not heard, what is perceived, perception is reality. Be super careful, folks, about your statements that relate to the school district. Just stay safe.
I'm not here as a board member for the Freehold Regional. I was going to a council meeting, and as a parent or a, citizen or whatever, why don't I have,
Everybody hear the question? May I go to a municipal meeting and announce I'm not here as a member of the Board of Education? I happen to be, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. These are my thoughts as a citizen. May you say that? Absolutely.
Do you have to say that?
I would suggest that you say that.
well, we've had that in the past with ethics.
I would suggest that you say that. My concern is not so much, my voice is getting there. Full day lecture. My concern is not so much in that controlled environment, which might even be taped, and we know exactly what you say.
Right.
My concern is much more what gets shared online. Those casual passing conversations in the community, as well as conduct. And you're governed by the code of ethics, right? So let's jump in. And there are a number of tenets. I'm not going to step through all of them. I'm going to hit those which I think are truly our best practices today. No micromanaging. I will carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they're well run. One of our district's board members became very concerned about a violent incident that involved high school seniors, 18 years old. So his name, because he's a man now, runs the local paper. A holdup, if you will, without a weapon at a convenience store. And it's running in the news. Social media is all buzz. It was after hours on a weekend, no other students were involved. It didn't involve the campus. Does the school district have any jurisdictional authority to discipline that student? I would say no. I would say no. We hear from law enforcement it's not considered a violent offense. The probation order doesn't provide restrictions. But then we hear questions from board members. I want this on the exec agenda to talk about what happened in the community. Why? Right? Can we take action? No, we can't.
Yeah, but the fact that the students, as we're talking about it, or it's the students in school, put in it, then they take action on that.
And I'll respond to that. If there is an active disruption or interference in the professional opinion of the administration and teaching staff, yes. Otherwise, the point is, folks, the question there is a policy question. We can't talk about that micro issue of that student, but we can certainly talk about what are our disciplinary rules. What's the boundary of our authority? Not to administer, not a phone call saying, hey, we got to suspend that young man, he can't come back. But please explain for me how we would respond when we would respond. Policy as opposed to the individual action. I'll confine my board action to policy making, planning, and appraisal. thought to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. It's this very unique system that we have, where we recognize as a public entity, funded publicly. So we're going to permit local constituents to elect officials to oversee, but we're going to make sure that State Department of Education certified trained educators are making recommendations. Consulting those who will be affected by them as divined by your business official, by your chief educator, by others. What information may a school board member access?
People have access about the school, with their employees, or access about, let's say what?
Employees, that's personnel, isn't it?
Maybe go on personnel.
You can access their information,
Let's-
personal information.
Let's come back to, again, where we began from. And again, I suggest that we think about the role up there and the role at the committee level. You have access to information that's relevant to that committee conversation. You have access to information that is relevant to the personnel action that you take there. That likely is not the entire personnel file, but perhaps in a Donaldson hearing, there is a conversation about evaluations. If there's a recommendation for a new hire, are we looking at resumes and applicants? Are we hearing summaries of everybody that we reviewed? Are we looking at the matrix, right? What information do we need to inform our decision making?
Well, I have a question. If
Right.
we see a need for a board,
Yes.
you know, I have 45 years of education, I know everybody, in this area. You know, and we know something, you know something,
So there's a question about sharing information. And should you share information if you're aware of an issue with your superintendent? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's exactly the way to do it, Mr. President. Not to bring it up here, we always follow the golden rule of no surprises. When there's a question, when there's an issue, when there's a feedback, the most effective boards operate before we get here. Sometimes members of the public get confused by that as well, because they don't know the hours upon hours upon hours upon hours that go into committee meetings and otherwise to prepare you all for the action that's taken up there. But that also gets to the nature of the meeting. A public board meeting is a meeting of the board in public because of Senator Byron Baer's Open Public Meetings Act. It is not a meeting for the public. It is not a meeting of the public. It is not a meeting to address the public or to engage in back and forth or Q&A with the public. The Open Public Meetings Act is clear that the public has every right, in fact, we have to do this. Sean always makes sure that we do this. We have to hear, that's why it's public comment, not public question and answer. And that comment goes again to taking action. We want to hear what constituents have to say about agenda items or otherwise, to inform the action that's up there during that public meeting. There are differences in structure between some boards or boards of the whole, which means there are work sessions, which means they're not committee operations. Those boards have public work sessions and others that operate by committee. They're different, frankly, from my perspective, in trust. Committees take a lot of the load individually and do a lot of the work. But other members of the board have to rely upon the information that those committee members have heard in making certain recommendations. I touched on this. Your job is not to rubber stamp personnel or other recommendations. Your job is to take very seriously, very comprehensively, recommendations that are provided to you. But just as we talked about policy and operations, if there's a concern about the integrity of a recommendation, the question ought to go to the process, not to the individual. And unless there is some bona fide, real reason to say no, there's an expectation that you follow that recommendation. I will support and protect school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. That's all, including your superintendent. That doesn't mean you can't raise questions. That doesn't mean if a member of the community brings a concern to you that it can't be chased down. But that chasing down and that conversation is not up here for the first time. It's over the phone shared with the board president or the superintendent. Because the Ethics Act also says that you're not going to take individual action, and you're going to permit an administrative process to address that concern. If we make public negative comments about employees, we're actually violating both this ethics tenet, as well as likely the confidentiality rights of our employees. So I joked before, I said the board president gets twice the stipend. And we don't have a full auditorium here, but I will be very clear. None of these board members receive a nickel for their service. And the board president is even lawyer, math. The board president receives double, zero. This is selfless service. The role is different, though, in that the board president's charged with these things amongst others, particularly to speak on behalf of, particularly to lead this body, set the agenda working with the superintendent, regulate these meetings, assist, give voice to concerns to administration and otherwise. What happens after a split vote? Let's say we get a divided vote. We get a vote that just barely passes. But it passes. Can that issue be brought up at the next meeting? The answer is no. The answer is no. In fact, there's certain hyper-technical Robert's rules, things that Mr. Boyce stays up at night looking at, climbing deep inside that parliamentary procedure. When an issue fails, it can't even be brought up again unless by the majority. And ethically, our School Ethics Act has said, in this one case, and I'm mindful of our time, so I haven't gone through a lot of the cases, but you have the cases in front of you. I know you will go home and pour through them. There's a signature page on the front so that you can share that with Mr. Boyce so that can be kept for CUSAC purposes. But the point is, once the board speaks, the board speaks. Do you have a right to voice your concern? Yes. Do you have a right to vote based on your legitimate considerations? Yes. But once the vote's decided, the vote's decided. You have to move on. That's the point. We talked about this. Think about your words. To whom and where. When and why. We live in, folks, difficult, partisan, divisive times. You see it in education. You've seen it during the last 2.5 years. I applaud your work. There's a reason why New Jersey's number one. Our school districts gave consistency to our students at a time when they needed consistency. Very rarely are folks motivated from the community to come out here and say thank you for it. They're motivated to come out and share their heartfelt and sincere concerns. I don't think we ever should think that we've taken our hat off, because you don't know what the perception is of your comments or words. What board information is confidential?
Can I ask you a question from previous?
Please.
But we attempted to issue a board employee rice notice without seeking board authority. What's the right rice notice? That's not our position.
So our colleague is sharing one of the cases that are in front of you where a board member tried to rice on his own employees that that individual could be spoken about in exec, and that's not the way it works. If there's a concern, the concern shared, and actually we can get to that in a minute, that concern shared with the board president, shared with the administration, and will pursue it if there is action to be taken by the board. That can include withholding, like potentially non-renewal, like be some other kind of disciplinary action, then there may be a conversation. But those mechanical and process requirements, your professionals and your administrators. Well, board information is confidential. I think the easier question is what board information is not confidential. We used to talk about packets being delivered, don't leave a packet on the kitchen table, right? Those times have passed. Now it's don't leave that screen open. Even the good stuff, even that stuff in exec is super confidential. The only information that's not confidential, folks, is the information that's shared up there. It's the information that's on the agenda. But even the process of that sausage getting made, and what goes on behind the scenes, we can't be talking about. May a board member investigate a community concern?
If I had a community member come to me, I feel that
So,
investigate.
and that's the word, right? The job of the board member is to discern the aspirations of your constituents. The Ethics Act says that. Again, we charge our communities to elect public officials that are going to make sure that our schools roll. When folks come to you with concerns, thank you for your concern. I can't speak on it, but I will make sure I share it. Have you called the building principal? Have you called the superintendent? I'll share your concern. I encourage you to share that concern with the administration and work your way up. You may share a concern, and again, make sure and see that that concern is chased down. But it's not the role of the board member to follow that. Volunteering. I think, and some of you know, there is no more important extracurricular activity than the arts. Our arts are phenomenal. We had a situation where an individual who was an assistant director to the musical, his wife was the director. They were both teachers. Put on great productions. It's up in Morris County. The assistant director retired. May he continue as assistant director. Assistant director, and this is after he's elected to the Board of Education. May he continue as assistant director. Assistant director, subject to the authority of the director, who's subject to the authority of the principal, who's subject to the authority of the superintendent, who arguably is subject to his authority. Doesn't feel right. Does it?
It just changed over the last year.
So there are a lot of conflicting decisions on this. Point is, folks, and it's kind of unfair, because who volunteers, right? You're the most important volunteers in this district. You give selflessly. Many of you have come up from PTOs and athletic organizations and otherwise. But the point is, we got to make sure there's no conflicting message. May you volunteer in a very limited, not supervisory way, after advising the board, the president, and the superintendent. Be careful. Be careful at all times. If there are questions, I'll answer them. Otherwise, I again applaud you for your selfless service to put the great work. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not a drop, but it's close to it.
So we can stay here, right?
Pete, we're just gonna motion to go to.
Yeah, just motion.
Hey, Jay.
Good, good.
Could I have a motion to go into executive session?
Motion.
Second.
Hearing a second, all in favor?
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. Pursuant to the Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law of 1975, this meeting notice was sent to the Asbury Park Press on August 29th, and has been duly advertised in the Asbury Park News on September 1st, 2022. That all municipal clerks of the townships, the boroughs within the Freehold Regional High School District has been duly notified, and the requirements of this posting was met on August 29th, 2022. Please join me, let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Montenegro, do you have any changes to the agenda?
No, Mr. President, thank you. Not to the executive agenda.
Can I have a motion to approve the minutes of the January 5th, 2023 reorganization meeting?
Second.
Any discussion, board? Not hearing any discussion, roll call, please.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mrs. Capiello,
Yes.
Mrs. Finelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes.
Mrs. Ladden,
Yes.
Mrs. McCobb,
Abstain.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes. A reminder, communications are on file with our board secretary. Dr. Sampson, superintendent report.
Thank you, Mr. Bruno. Good evening, everyone. So we're gonna open this evening. We're at Colts Neck High School, so we have Brielle Bravaco, who's a member of the Student Executive Cabinet, to give a little update about the happenings here at Colts Neck. And obviously, the Executive Cabinet, plays an integral role in helping to keep us informed and also serving as that liaison from my office to the schools, and they're always sort of we test everything out on that as we're thinking about it. And we had a meeting earlier this week that sometimes we just sit and talk, which is also how we learn about what's really on the minds of the students that we serve. So Brielle, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you.
Good evening. My name is Brielle Bravaco, and I'm a member of the Superintendent's Executive Student Cabinet. Tonight, I'm proud to be here to share the amazing opportunities that Colts Neck High School has to offer. As a member of the Executive Student Cabinet representing Colts Neck High School, we meet monthly to discuss highlights and programs from our schools and how we and the student body can contribute and grow aspects of our school community. Our conversations focus and prioritize the values of knowledge, relationships, and unity within our district. At Colts Neck High School, promoting unity and strong relationships is a top priority. A perfect example of this inclusiveness was demonstrated during the National Honor Society's winter season door decorating contest. Students had the opportunity to showcase their creative flair and add some cheer by decorating the teachers' doors. The contest was made even more meaningful by involving the custodial staff who cast their votes to determine the winners. This small but powerful gesture serves as a reminder that relationships within the school encompass not only teachers and administrators, but all members of the CNHS community. Such initiatives help to strengthen the bonds of unity and foster a sense of belonging at the school. The Career Connections Club plays a vital role in building a strong and lasting friendships among students. As an active member, I can personally attest to the positive impact this club has had on my school experience. Every Tuesday, we gather together to participate in various events and activities that bring us closer together. From the festive trunk or treat to the heartwarming Friendsgiving celebration and the upcoming Valentine's Day activities we have, Career Connections creates opportunities for us to come together, have fun, and create memories that will last a lifetime. These events foster a sense of unity and community within our school, solidifying the bonds that we have and strengthening the friendships we share. I'd like to take a moment to highlight the educational opportunities that Colts Neck High School offers. Our magnet programs include our widely recognized JROTC program and our Law and Public Service program. Both programs allow students to explore their interests and benefit from networking and internship that our school district encourages. As a Law and Public Service program student, once a week from 1 to 3, I intern at the Monmouth County Courthouse and get a glimpse of the law sector. This is a prime example of the way that CNHS prioritizes students exploring their interests in and outside of the classroom and building community connections. CNHS is incredibly proud to offer the English language learning program to the student body. The school's passionate teachers and supportive community create an environment where students can flourish and in their English language learning, setting them up for academic success. In closing, attending Cold Snake High School means being provided with not only a phenomenal education, but a positive, inclusive, and supportive learning environment as well. Teachers and students in the building want to see each other grow and succeed, and in doing so, acknowledge the knowledge and relationships that unite us as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. And this year's exec cabinet members have also been really instrumental in helping us move forward the strategic planning process, especially serving as leaders in the building. And student voice is really important to us in capturing what the student experience actually is here across the Field Regional High School District. And so, Rio, you've done a great job. Thank you very much. We're going to move on. I'm going to turn it over for the next part of my report to Mr. Boyce, who's going to introduce, and board, you might want to move down to the seats below to watch the presentation. And Mr. Boyce, I'll turn it over to you for the transportation presentation at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Sampson. So, board, as you move into the audience to view the presentation, we're in budget development season now, and given the continuing and compounding impact of legislation known as S2, which we've talked about relentlessly over the last 5 years, we move into year 6, and that's followed by year 7. The district has lost a great deal of funding, and in preparation for some of the difficult decisions that lie ahead of us in the years to come, one area, given the scale of the loss of state aid, one of the areas that we knew we needed to consider was transportation services to the district. So at the beginning of this school year, we issued a request for proposal. We received proposals, evaluated them, and ultimately engaged Ross Haber Associates to perform a certain scope of work that includes looking very closely at our existing operation and then also modeling out for us what changes would look like under legislation and under certain conditions, and for the board's consideration in finalizing the budget adoption. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Ross Haber and Tim Ammon to provide an update on the status of their work so far. So, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the board, Dr. Sampson, Mr. Boyce. Appreciate the opportunity to come here and present the preliminary aspects of our analyses that have been conducted to date around transportation concerns and options that may exist from an evaluating transportation standpoint. What we want to be able to do tonight is to take you through the work that's been completed to date, including some assessment of options from both an operational and from a financial perspective. So I think as Sean had mentioned, the scope of work that we have undertaken has essentially 3 components to it. The first is to review the costs of transportation in terms of both their magnitude and the sources, in identifying what are the drivers, pardon the pun, I suppose, of transportation-related costs, and then to, within the scope of transportation services, to look at which services are required to be provided versus which services are being provided either electively or are being provided as a matter of choice. And then finally to think about what the range of options might be in terms of looking at the scope of transportation services and how we may be able to assess demand and changes to cost that would come to changes in the way that we provide transportation services. So just to provide everybody a baseline, I realize that that it's a little bit small for people to see, but if we look at transportation, it's an approximately $24 million business, of which we are looking at in-district costs of approximately $10 million and all other contracted costs of about $14 million. And within that scope, we were transporting about 11,000 kids using about 400 routes and 270 buses. So one of the things that we see is, and this is certainly a positive and reflective of well considerations within the transportation operation, is that there are a number of logistical strategies that are in place where what we are trying to do, just by looking at 400 routes and 270 buses, it means that some portion of the buses are being used more than once, right, to accomplish multiple missions. A logistical process called tiering, which we're in favor of. In addition, there is a range of schools that are combined, where we're transporting students from multiple schools at the same time, which is a logistical strategy called combination runs, something else that is used to try to drive efficiency into the system. So those two things certainly are reflective of efforts on the part of the transportation operation to make efficient use of the resources. In doing that, one of the things that we'll talk about here is from a transportation efficiency standpoint. A key consideration that we have, particularly here, is what proportion of the seats that are available to us are we filling with students from a plan basis and on an actual basis. And one of the things that we see is, on an overall value, we see 7 out of 10 seats being full. And that, from our perspective, having done hundreds of these studies across the country, that is an efficiently designed structure. Anything in the 60s is actually pretty efficient. In the 70s actually represents a strong degree of efficiency. And what we see is, when we break this down in some of the component parts of the operation, we see that the in-district routes are actually almost closer to 80, which is really, really well thought out in terms of the use of planned seating capacity. In some of the contracted routes, the values are lower, but that is because in a number of instances, the contracted routes are servicing kids who are attending schools outside of their home boundaries, which, as you can imagine, just given the time to travel and so forth, it creates some inefficiency in the system that results in lower capacity use. And as we start to think about what options might be available, one of the things that we'll talk about here is, transportation is essentially a time and distance problem. And if we have schools that are starting at relatively near times, it makes it very difficult for us to reuse assets, which requires, in the end, more assets. So when we think about drivers of transportation costs, one of the things that we think about is how many seats are full and how much time do we have to fill those seats. And given that the distance between the schools and the relative closeness of dwell times, accomplishing multiple missions is a challenge. So we have to be highly focused on our use of the seats as a measure of efficiency. And one of the things that we have looked at here is to try to understand how is this all being accomplished from an administrative and a managerial perspective. And when we look at the personnel cost structure as part of the makeup of the transportation costs, the way your organization is designed, the way that it's aligned, and the overall cost is within the guidelines of what we would expect to see in an operation of this size and complexity. And so what we don't believe is that there's a significant amount of administrative inefficiency that can just get immediately squeezed out of the system. So from a personnel perspective, we don't see big reductions in personnel costs in the transportation management component of things as a viable strategy to achieving significant transportation. So when we think about transportation, ultimately what we have to try to do is to address this question of how do we meaningfully reduce transportation costs. But when we're doing that, there are a number of considerations that Ross and I take into consideration when we're thinking about this. Clearly, we're in the business of thinking about safety. How do we safely transport students? But in addition, when we look at options, one of the things that we're trying to ensure is that whatever we come up with, students who are in similar situations are being treated similarly, right? So that's the consistency of the application of services across the entire district. So that becomes a factor in terms of how we look at what options might be available for changes to either the methodology or the structure of transportation. And then lastly, what we want to try to do is, and this points to one of the notes that Sean made in his opening comments. Because this is not a single year problem, one of the things that we are focused on is what strategies can we undertake that would allow for persistent savings over time. Right? So how are we making meaningful reductions and retaining those savings over time, recognizing that we have annual changes in cost as a consequence of inflation and the way that where the distribution of kids and everything else. So a big consideration for us is over what period of time do we think these savings can be retained. So in looking at it, in essence, what we see are two separate models in terms of options for reducing transportation costs. The first is a set of targeted changes, and in the end, that is changes to how we are actually providing transportation in the current moment. So not significant changes to the structure, but maybe inefficiencies that we can squeeze out of the system that result in some cost reduction to the overall scope of transportation services. And then the second option is thinking about demand reduction. And when we think about demand reduction, that's really changes to who actually receives transportation. So who's eligible and who receives transportation services. And we'll talk about what we think some of the options are in both of those realms as we get a little further downstream. When we think about that $24 million in transportation costs, so one of the things that we have to realize, and we mentioned this a little bit at the beginning in terms of the scope, is there are certain services that are either mandated or required that are going to limit our ability to assume that full $24 million is available in order to take costs out of the system. When we look at special needs transportation requirements, particularly requirements that are identified as part of AAP or as part of 504 plans or whatever it might be, our options to reduce those services are different than they are for general ed students, as I think you're all aware. And so that puts a bit of a collar on how much of that $24 million we can actually look to try to take savings out of. And the same thing happens with, even though it's a more limited population, homeless students, foster care, those kinds of services that have, particularly under both special needs and homeless and foster care, have federal mandates associated with them that do place pretty significant limitations on our ability to change the way services are being provided. And when we look at the cost of services as they exist right now, that represents about 30% of that $24 million. So in the end, what we're talking about is, just to make math a little bit easier, is roughly $16 million of that $24 million. Okay? So when we think about the basics of trying to save transportation costs, right, and this is like the easiest sort of transportation 101 you can have, right, there's basically two goals that we have to have. The first one is, and we're doing this here in the district, is we have to try to fill the bus to the greatest extent possible. Right? These are the things that drive efficiency. If we're using as many seats as we possibly can, that gives us the opportunity to be efficient in the use of capacity. And then we want to try to reuse that same asset as many times as possible. Right? Because then that is essentially allowing us to take that 54-passenger asset for the sake of argument, and if we use it 3 times, it's really a 162-passenger asset. Right? So that's where the time component of things becomes an aspect of this. So when we think about transportation, the mantra that we provide to folks when we are looking for efficiencies is, what can we do to fill it and what can we do to reuse it? And anything that we're doing to impede either one of those is going to drive inefficiency into the system and more than likely end up costing us money in some way. So the nature of what we're looking for is opportunities to do both of these when we are looking at cost savings. So as we mentioned, there's sort of 2 categories of cost savings that we think are available. The first is the set of targeted opportunities, which we have estimated to be approximately $1 million. And they are from taking some inefficiency out of the current system. So there are, as we mentioned, there are high rates of capacity across the system, but that doesn't mean that every individual route has a high rate of capacity. So we think there are some opportunities to look at individual routes to try to tune up some of the routing there and gain some efficiencies through a reduction of assets that way. But what we know is there is not a significant amount of time for us to work with. So the fact that we might be able to do a little bit better job of filling the asset We still don't have a lot of opportunities to reuse the asset without pretty significant changes in bell times. So from the possibility of savings from this, again, it just becomes more supplemental to the services than if we were to look at some of the demand reduction strategies that we'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. And we have another challenge, which is, as you have all well experienced over the last few years, the driver shortage that exists out there has actually forced us to take many of the efficiencies that we would have otherwise had, because there just aren't enough butts to be in enough seats to get kids to school, right? So the challenge of where it is and this is a weird thing from a consultant to say, but like, it's really too bad that you guys are efficient, right? Because if we were inefficient, we'd have a lot more opportunities to save money. But the driver shortage and the way that your folks have been managing the system have driven efficiency into the system, so it has the effect of limiting some of the savings that we might otherwise achieve. And you know, there are certain things that we can do when we look at this, which is including things like looking at stop consolidation, so there's larger groups of students at individual stop locations, which has the effect of being able to speed routes up some, because we're not stopping as many times. Again, thinking about transportation as a time and distance problem. But the ability to do that, if we can't pair schools together because of the bell time structure, we only have a limited amount of capacity that's going to create. That may improve service a little bit, but it's not going to result in substantial cost reductions. So we do want to try to take advantage of these when we can, but one of the things that we have to recognize is that from a strategic perspective, the targeted opportunities will be supplemental to when we change the nature of how we provide services. When we think about demand reduction, as I mentioned, ultimately what we're saying here is who's eligible for service. Right? Currently, essentially, all students are eligible for services, and one of the things that we are looking at is if we start from the standpoint of state guidelines, which is 2.5 miles for high school students, and use that as the first tranche of changes in demand that we might make. What does that mean in terms of changing the number of students that are eligible for services, and consequently the number of buses we need, and then therefore ultimately the costs that we may incur? Right? So that's when we are looking at demand reduction, that's what we're looking at. Is we're looking at the number of kids who might be transported by changing the number of kids who are eligible. So in order to think about that, one of the things that we want to be able to do, and that Ross will take you through here now, is to just talk some about how from an individual school level, changes in demand might look if we start at 2.5 miles and think about some of the other changes that may be possible.
Okay, so what you're looking at are the current attendance zones for each of the regional high schools. These are the actual attendance zones. And what we wanted to take a look at throughout this process is not only how many kids go to the school, but how many kids actually attend schools that are outside of their home attendance zone. So again, those are the attendance maps. We will provide you with maps with detail and things like that that you can zoom in on. It took us, I would say, a good 6 weeks to be able to run down these attendance zones. But we have them now, and it was really helpful in the process. So what we're looking at now is the Colts Neck attendance zone. Those turquoise lines represent distances from this school, walk distances from the school. The outer circle is 2.5 miles. The next circle in is 2 miles. Circle in after that is 1.5 miles, and then the final circle is 1 mile. And what we're doing through this process is calculating the total number of students who would be eligible at these different mileage levels. Now, it's a little hard to see, but those black dots on the outside are showing the total number of students who attend Colts Neck High School, who reside outside the school, outside of the actual attendance zone. Those are general ed students. Special ed and vocational ed students are not in these calculations. So these are the total number of kids in the zone, the black dots, and the kids outside of the zone, the pink being the zone. Okay. One kid. Each one represents one kid. So if you take a look, this would be This is Freehold Borough High School. This is Freehold, yeah, it's Freehold Borough High School. Part of the map is,
Yeah.
because you're not getting the scope of the number of kids. It's cut off.
Right.
So,
I'm sorry?
okay, so let's.
Ross, and I think as we go through these maps, the message is where are the concentrations of kids relative to the attendance zone, because we know all of the black dots are where the kids live, right? And all of those kids go, in this case, Freehold Township High School, but we're not going to be counting the black dots on this map, but you can see where the heavy concentration of kids is relative to the circles representing the distances from schools.
Exactly. Okay, so this is Howell High School, and again, the distribution based on the mileages and the locations of the students. Manalapan High School, again, same kind of
Can
thing.
you go back to the house?
I'm sorry? Sure.
Go back.
So again, you can see what the densities are on these maps. It's kind of enlightening. Okay. This is Manalapan High School, and and this Marlboro High School. You see again the densities and the distances outside the zone. Okay. And do you want to take this?
So I think that what we were trying to do with the maps is to give a sense of, within those concentric rings, how many students would we need to transport. And what we can see is, and again, what we have done in order to make some cost estimates, is we've done two things. We've estimated the number of students who would be eligible for services. We've made an assumption about how many students we could put on a bus. So for a 54-passenger bus, we've assumed 60 students because we know some high school students aren't going to ride. And so we have a strategy already of overloading buses, so that's consistent with what we're doing now. And then in order to come up with two values, the first being what is the net change in the number of resources required, we take the number of eligible students and divide them by 60, and that gives us a sense of the number of buses that we're going to require. And so as you can see, just at 2.5 miles for across the system, we have roughly 6,500 students who are eligible, which would require 108 buses. We are currently using, for those same groups of students, 168 buses, so we have an actual net reduction in the number of assets of 60. And then in order to determine what the cost might be, one of the things that we did is to take existing costs of a 54-passenger asset as the representative vehicle for this, and to think about what was the median cost of that asset right now, and what is the likely change in that cost for next year as a result of inflation. Because one of the things that we want to be considerate of is inflationary costs over the last 2 years, and probably in the next 2 years coming, are significantly different than the inflationary costs that we have incurred in the years prior. Right? So one of the adjustments that we wanted to use is to ensure that we were accounting for that inflationary value of the cost of the contracts. And so at that point it becomes a math problem, right? We have the number of buses that we might reduce times what we project the cost to be to provide us with what the projected potential savings are. And what you can see in the distribution is at each of the tranches that we spoke about, the mile, mile and a half, 2 and 2.5, you can see the individual values. But then what is, I think, more illuminating is the change in values between the tranches. So if we look at the difference between a mile and a half, we have in the neighborhood of a $900,000 difference. If we look at the difference between 2 miles and 2.5 miles, we have in the neighborhood of $1.4 million difference. Right? So, and keep in mind, these end up being cumulative savings, right? Because if we go to a mile and a half, that includes the mile counts. Right? So the challenge here is to be thinking about at each of these different tranches, how does eligibility change, and consequently, how does the potential cost savings change? And what we see, again, is the notable difference at the outer ring at 2.5 miles. It's a 3,600 students that would not have a bus. It's 108 buses that would be required.
Which number is it?
3,600, it's this number.
For the whole district?
Yes. Of the general ed students that are included. Because again, for purposes of this assessment, we've removed special needs students, we've removed vocational students for purposes of this first part of the analysis.
So like the first, 2.5, it's 3,000.
Yes. And again, what we can see, and I'll take you just through the columns just to make sure, this is the number, these are the number of students that we would be planning transportation for. This is the number of students that would no longer be eligible. This is the number of buses that we are projecting would be required, which is this number divided by 60. The net change is 168 minus whatever this number is, right? And with some rounding, right?
You have the 3,600 broken down for school. Like how many for school?
We can, yeah, we don't have it here. And then obviously the math is this times this equals that. Okay? And one of the things that we have not done here, this is purely an exercise in understanding very strict lines of eligibility. So we have not, in this analysis, considered anything for hazardous transportation or anything like that. This is purely, if you're inside or outside that line, you're eligible or you're not. No hazardous is considered in this as of right now.
But special ed?
Special ed is taken out, correct. So when we think about it, one of the consequences of this, and one of the things that we have been looking at, other questions on this just before I move on? One of the things that we've been looking at is the question of out-of-district vocational students. I think as Ross was pointing out in the other maps, one of the things that we see here is you see this enormous buckshot distribution of students across the district going to various schools, which from a logistics standpoint is not super, right? It's really hard for us to fill and reuse the bus when we've got low density services that we're trying to provide. So when we're looking at this group of approximately 600 students going to these 5 schools, one of the things that we're thinking about is what's the way to try to address, what's the impact of this pattern in particular, this low density pattern, on the overall cost of transportation services and what we might be do about changing it. When we look at it and break it down in some more detail, one of the things that we see, if you remember, an inflation-adjusted value of $61,000 overall on the in-district costs. When we look at these services in particular, we see a median value of $80,000 per route. Right? So we've got some very high cost routes that are associated with this kind of a service. So when we look at the 41 routes in total, we have in a neighborhood of $3.2 million in costs associated with it. And when we look at it on a cost per rider basis, right, which is one of the key efficiency statistics that we look at from a transportation standpoint, cost per rider here is about $6,000 a student versus in-district services where it's about $1,000 a student. Right, so that 6x factor is not unexpected. When we see low-density services are typically 4, 6, 8 times as much as traditional in-district higher density services. So that number is not surprising from a ratio standpoint. It's just, it can be surprising that it's that much more expensive on a per unit basis to transport these students. And when we look at any kind of demand reduction, if we look at anything other than demand reduction for them, what I mean is when we look at route services, this is really where some of the targeted savings opportunities might exist. If we were to make revisions to routes or consolidations to routes, there are some opportunities here. One of the things that we see is all these services have multiple routes servicing the school. And if we look, one of the things that they have is they have comparatively very low capacity use, right? We mentioned 69% overall. In these services in particular, it's only 35%. So if you think about, if we round up for the sake of argument, that's 4 out of every 10 seats filled instead of 7 out of every 10, right? So that's the impact of low density. The impact of low density is that dramatic reduction in capacity use. And so one of the things that we would have to think about is how can we either speed up the routes or or create time in order to try to better use these assets. What we think is through some of these targeted strategies, there's probably an opportunity within this group, without doing any major changes to demand, of a 5 to 8 bus reduction. And so if we're thinking about it on a median value that has again been adjusted for inflation, we're talking in the neighborhood of $400,000 to $700,000 in cost change. And where we think there might be some other opportunities, assumptions that we haven't made into this analysis as of yet, is changing at a material level the length of student rides or any of those kind of other things. We've kept them all in the ballpark of where they are now. And if we were to do that, there would become a greater opportunity to try to achieve some savings within this group of students.
So we change the route, that's safe.
Could, right, yeah, correct.
I have a question. Are we responsible for 100% of the finances for the Monmouth County high school, the busing, transportation? Are we?
Yes, the answer is yes. And just
are those schools open all the same time? They start in the morning?
no, they are staggered some, but I can tell you that the vocational bus routes are single-tier routes, which also adds to the inefficiency of it, right? So our high schools, 3 on one tier and 3 on the next tier, so one bus has 2 runs within its work for any given day. But when we were looking at each of the individual schools and the maps, just to get a sense of the density of the students within those rings, the shaded area was the attendance area for that particular school that we were looking at. For vocational students, the shaded area would be the entire district, right? So it's a 200 square mile footprint. So it's a huge footprint. I think Buckshot is a good description of they could be anywhere, right? So with such a low efficiency standard, with only a single use of the bus, and not being able to fill buses to capacity, because then we would be looking at a 2.5, 3 hour bus ride to school, right? Because it's going to have to cover a lot more ground to pick up enough students to fill a bus up, right? So those are some of the specific challenges with the vocational school districts.
Also, I just want to mention, even within your trip home, means less students in the buses, especially if they're doing activities in their sending district.
So,
Parents would have to pick them up to get from practice or wherever they're involved.
right, so, and I think Tim may have a bullet, and Tim and Ross have a bullet point on that, but I'll jump them on that. Really across the district, right? The utilization of our buses in the afternoon is far less than in the morning. However, there's no way to isolate that, and have morning bus runs and afternoon bus runs. There would be, but the logistics of that would be overwhelming and, in all likelihood, potentially more expensive.
It very much changed the relationship that you have with the contractors.
Right, because...
In your own staff.
Right. I mean, the same bus runs that are happening in the morning would need to cover the same area because it could be any kid. So it needs to be ready to hit every bus stop as it did in the morning on the way in.
So as we think about the structure of the choice and the choices that need to be made, one of the things that we clearly are trying to recognize here is ultimately the level of impact is going to be dependent on the degree of cost savings that we need and how long we want to maintain those savings. Right? So that ultimately becomes part of the discussion in terms of refining and identifying what the actual savings might be from this. One of the things that is clear is, again, transportation is essentially a demand and supply problem also. Changes in demand are going to have notably more impact than the targeted changes. They work well together, and the targeted changes can be very useful as a supplement, but significant dollar savings, I think as you've seen through the tables, get achieved through changes in demand. The same savings are not available just through changes in some of the targeted services. So when we think about some of those considerations, I mean, obviously these things have a whole web of things to be considered, but one of the things that we know is changes in demand are likely to impact the district writ large. virtually all students will be impacted in some way, because we have to, when we're thinking about essentially moving to something other than the existing eligibility model, right, there are ripple effects that will occur across the district. We will also have to have considerations around this question of hazard services and the design and development of hazard services. Having a policy around it, if the district chooses to provide for hazard transportation, the development of the policy and the structure of that policy is something that's going to have to get considered. In addition, one of the things that will become evident as we start to think about the design of a hazard program, hazard identification, is that it's going to have some impact on potential savings, because we're going to essentially be taking some of those students and putting them back in the pool, which will reduce the savings that are projected as they are right now. And then we'll have other considerations to the degree that this isn't something that's happening already, but we just have parking and traffic concerns around the schools in terms of getting in and for students who may be driving, what the options are available for there. And then lastly, what other options might be available for mitigating loss of service. One of the things that's available here in the state is a set of subscription services, right, where you can, as a parent, you can pay for the ride. And that structure can be done in a multitude of different ways. But what we know is the degree to which we allow for subscription services if we're going to guarantee those services, meaning it doesn't matter if one student signs up or 50 students signs up, we're going to apply a bus to this. There is likely to be some subsidization of that service that's going to be required, and that consequently has an effect on the potential savings that we might have. And then lastly, I think, and this is something that is ongoing, obviously, in the department, but is just a reminder that we're going to have to continue to look for, is looking at opportunities to create time in the system, whether that's through changes to bell times, whether that's changes to arrival and drop-off times, whatever it might be, that allow for those continuing efficiency efforts and our ability to try to pursue those as additional supplemental savings to whatever is ultimately determined to be based on the structure of the system as it's designed.
So a few comments, Tim and Ross, on the presentation, and then we'll go to board members with any questions or comments that they may have, and then we'll wrap it up. When we went through the maps of the schools, right, so the schools are going to be impacted differently depending on where they live in relation to the circle that's going to be deemed ineligible. And that's just simply a matter of the geography of it. So, but I can tell you that Colts Neck and Howell are the least impacted based on where their students currently reside. Freehold Borough is the most impacted based on where students reside. Freehold Township, Manalapan, and Marlborough are somewhere in between. I would characterize them as all significantly impacted, right? So, you know, at the 2.5 mile, that's a third of our kids. That's a third of our students that would be impacted. But something that was said, and I want to emphasize that, is that all students are potentially impacted by this. It's not a matter of simply if you're outside of that and eligible for transportation, then it's business as usual. Because the supplemental group, right, so there's the demand reduction, and that's where the meat of the savings are. But the supplemental group is also about efficiencies, and think of it, it has impact in different ways, but one of the substantial ways would be if we consolidate bus stops to come to the top of the neighborhood, right? That means that that bus is less time on the road dropping into the neighborhoods into several bus stops, right? So there's some efficiency there with fuel and whatnot, but it's really a time thing. It's more of a time thing. And where we have runs, bus runs that are not being filled to capacity, that savings of time allows us additional time to continue and get to additional kids and therefore bring up our capacity. So, and we'll do that where it makes sense, where we can do that safely and where it makes sense. The the number up there for the demand response at the maximum of 2.5 miles, 3.7 million roughly, that is at, you know, the pure, most hardcore form of it, right? It's at 2.5 miles. If you're in, then you're not eligible, and if you're out, you are eligible. And districts have, there's a whole range of degrees of implementation of this. Our thinking at this point is, and this is regarding hazardous routes, right, is that as we design routes as a result of the decisions that are made, we are going to identify some areas that are hazardous, and I'll use the obvious example of, I'm not going to have a kid cross Route 9, right? That's an obvious one, that's a hazardous area. And there are others, right? And we'll make those decisions, and we'll bake that into the route development. But in addition to that, it's something that we can use going forward, is to come up with a set of criteria, and there are plenty of examples out there of districts, point systems, what's the speed limit on the road, is the distance, or are there sidewalks, right, and are they walking against traffic? So there are a bunch of criteria that if any parent requests a review, we'll have an objective mechanism to go through and score that situation, and then that'll be the determination. You know, the idea of safety, and we all know this, is subjective. It's heavily subjective, right? I can tell you my wife's idea of what's safe and what my idea of what's safe is different, vastly different, okay? So, and that's just in one house. But I think it's important that we have an objective measure, really for the administration of the policy that we're going to use, so that the transportation department has something to hang their hat on, right? So that'll be a separate discussion sort of posted, and that'll be reviewed by the board and approved by the board, and that's what, and it'll be reviewed annually by the board and either tweaked or just reinstated for the following year. So as we move through this, there'll be some growing pains. Some of my other thoughts here, the fill it or use it, and as we talked about it in the vocational context, but it's also true in the context of the kids that attend our schools that may live outside of that school's particular attendance area, right? The colored section of that particular map. We still have some of those same challenges there, where those students can come from anywhere across the district and make their way in. So although they will be outside, many of them will be outside of the 2.5 miles, they'll also we see some opportunities for stop consolidation and some savings to supplement our main demand response saving there as well. The other important piece to this is that we will work closely with the 6 police departments that host our 6 high schools in terms of, you know, a review of safety conditions, and I know that many districts work closely with their police departments on this. They'll also be helpful in helping guide us on traffic control at the school, right? Because if courtesy busing is diminished to some extent, then there's going to be a lot more traffic in front of the school, right? And that's something else that we have to think about and plan about and work with our police departments on. But let me open it up now to any comments or questions from board members. And I'll just open up for that. Mrs. Lavin?
I know you just hit this, but the students that are going to our learning centers and academies, they will always be bused.
Not if they live within the 2.5 mile radius, whatever radius we decide, which is leaning towards 2.5.
Schools are being being attended, correct?
No, so
Right.
the kids in the.
So if they live in Cold Snap and they're going to Freehold Borough, but they're within the 2.5, they're out of the 2.5 mile.
There's-
of Freehold Borough, then they're going to be bused.
That's right. They're students of Freehold Borough in your example. They may live in another town, but they're students of Freehold Borough. Okay? It's a good question.
The 2.5 mile is the road flies or on the road?
The-
It's street.
Yeah, it's actual walking distance, how you would do it. Right.
There's no sidewalks, is there areas that don't have sidewalks?
So Mrs. Lav is asking about sidewalks. So that's one of the considerations, along with many other, in developing criteria that we can use upon a parent's request to review their situation. But again, we're going to identify some of those areas that are, clearly not safe, where we don't want students walking, we don't want students crossing Route 9, for example. I'll use that as that. Mr. Bruno, do you have a question? No, I'm sorry. Mr. Parisi.
If the board were to decide to go in this direction, how do you see you changing your fleet? Are you going to reduce contracted routes? Are you going to reduce your fleet? Have you thought about that?
So we have, and we'll do what makes the most sense dollar-wise, right? And the cost of transportation, and Tim had mentioned earlier in an early on slide that it was $24 million for the current year that we're paying. Well, the last school year, that number was $20 million. So 20 to 24. So we're seeing huge increases in the cost of transportation, driven by a number of factors, most prominently a bus driver shortage, right? So everybody's competing for the drivers, and whether it's contracted or our own. We actually had budgeted for more of our own drivers, right? But we're unable to fill the positions. We budgeted for 110 drivers to drive our buses. We currently have 89. And we are recruiting, we're training, we're doing everything, but everybody is doing that. All the contractors, all the other districts are doing that. We've even adjusted some of our pay rates for certain situations to encourage some more participation in after school activities. And so it's a one-upsmanship going on among the districts and contractors to compete for drivers. It's in many ways, having all high schools and so many high school students, it really does provide a critical mass of interest to support the magnet programs that we have. And so there's some huge benefits in terms of opportunities. One of the ways it works against us is in tiering routes, right? So K-12 districts have middle schools and elementary schools. They'll have 3 tiers, 4 tiers of routes, because they have more flexibility with the start times of those other grade levels, where there's more to consider with high school students and the volume of after-school activities that they have. So my sense is that it's going to be contractors, which at the moment are the highest, on the higher side of our cost per route. So we're gonna most likely take that down and keep our own drivers and add drivers to the extent that we're able to.
I know that we had a problem with some of our contracted routes getting people to even bid on them.
Yeah.
So I don't think this district is in a situation where we can get into a bidding competition with other school districts because of our state aid situation.
So Mr. Parisi's comment is that the contractor prices has gone up, and the bid process. Now the bid process it's not a negotiations process, right? So you put a bid out, you receive the bids on a certain date, and the low bid gets it. Now if in some cases, and we've certainly had this instance this year, the low bid is 40% more than it was last year. And we've taken a real hit. We've had to make some decisions within the confines of the approved budgets to fund transportation during this current year, because increases at this level were not anticipated. The budget was put together with a fairly aggressive increase or conservative increase built into it, but in many cases we blew right by that, and it cost additional. The other
and it's really outside of the scope of this conversation, but it's been incredibly difficult to get coverage for our after-school events, away games for athletics, that type of thing. And I'll say that our principals and our SECAs and coaches have been tremendous in working together with other athletic directors in other districts to, hey, let's push the game, an hour here or move the game here. And parents have been very accommodating and patient with that. And they've really done a good job to try and reduce the impact of that, the inability to provide busing to the away games. One thing that we have in our favor with 6 high schools is that if we're playing each other somewhere, we can usually squeeze that in a shuttle, right, from one school to another, because they're all relatively close that way. So, that has helped, but, kudos to the building administration for really bobbing and weaving and making a lot of that happen with their sports communities. Chuck will supplement those comments.
So just a couple things for the board to think about and for the public to know. And Tim and Ross have done some fantastic work here for us. But the context of why we even have this presentation this evening, right? And what's brought us to here, because I think that our parents, our school community members, and even our students don't realize what has happened to the district from a legislative standpoint and what those impacts are long term. And so these gentlemen come this evening and say we're a victim of our own efficiency as it relates to transportation. Well, that's the same story across the board with the district finances, right? And this district, we've done everything that we can do to manage the $25 million cut that we've had to manage over the past several years. And it started years ago, right? So let's take, the first thing folks will say, well, you're gonna have to cut some staff. So I went back for this board meeting and we pulled all the positions that we've eliminated since I got here in 2011. We've eliminated 119 positions since 2011. So I don't want to hear anybody comment, you hear in the general public, oh, they have too much staff. So we've drawn it down by 119 positions. We've eliminated 7 administrative positions within that. And those are a whole range. And some of those 119 have come back, but mostly for things like security, additional paras, things of that nature. So from a faculty and staff standpoint, we've been incredibly efficient. Sean and I were literally the first crew in New Jersey I think we were the first to go through an energy savings improvement plan back in 2012, before anybody even knew what it was. We bonded internally for approximately $20 million at no cost to the taxpayers to do all of the HVAC work that was really pressing, particularly at Freehold High School at that time, but across the district. And it was a $20 million project that happened, again, at no cost to the taxpayers. We went out for a much more substantial referendum and purposefully waited until the debt from the construction of this building came off the books so that the community's taxes were still going down, but we were going to be able to offset a lot of the infrastructure needs that we had. Now that referendum went down 51% to 49%. And the unfortunate reality of that is that as a regional district, we go as the total vote goes. And in many of our towns, that referendum passed. But it was an effort to put it there. So we went back to the drawing board twice, and we ultimately passed a bare bones infrastructure referendum for $15 million that duct taped some of our roofing, paving, and other needs. So we've done that. We land on the shores with per pupil cost that our per pupil costs are literally in some cases $7,000 and $8,000 per pupil, less than the K-8s that send to us. As we run all of these athletic programs, all of these additional transportation costs, the fact that we're spending $6,000, $7,000 and $8,000 less per pupil
than many of the K-8s that surround us is frankly disgusting. But that's where we are. We're 45th out of 46 7 to 12 districts in the state of New Jersey in how much we spend. We've been bled dry here. And until the community revolts on what S2 has done, because there's only 2 years of it left, there's been 5 years of us fighting and clawing and scratching and talking to every legislator that we could, talking to representatives of the governor's office, going down and testifying, whether it was the Senate committee, the Assembly Ed committee, it doesn't matter where. All we've done is say, how can you take a district this efficient and gut it the way that you're gutting it? And frankly, the architect of S2, Senator Sweeney, in a meeting with NJASA last year in Atlantic City, stated that our district was an anomaly in all of this, that they didn't anticipate what was going to happen. But now we don't have anywhere to go, right? And that doesn't mean that while the state of New Jersey literally sits their backsides on $11 billion right now that they have unspent. We're one of the worst states in the nation to spend our federal dollars. One of the worst, which to me speaks of government malaise and ineptitude. But they're sitting on $11 billion. And for approximately $280 million of that, which is literally a fraction of that $11 billion, they could keep every school district in the state of New Jersey whole. Right? They could cut no district in the midst of recovering from COVID. So as we all sit here and grapple, the principals heard from me tonight about how upset I was about, some of the things that are happening in buildings, because kids are struggling way more than they were pre-COVID, certainly, right? And we're grappling with those needs. And we put things in place. And we funded our Raise Academy through our federal dollars. We're funding additional security officers in the buildings through our federal dollars. So we're going to have to make some hard decisions on what we do with that as well. Our reserves are actually dangerously low now. This isn't a district where you can duct tape things. When we had to fix a boiler at Marlboro High School 2 years, $800,000, right? Like these things come up, right? We have 6 huge buildings and a transportation depot and a central administration. Right? There's a lot of infrastructure for us to take care of that, frankly, we can no longer take care of without going out to referendum every 2 to 3 years. We cannot do it financially. And so we're now about $11 million under adequacy. We anticipate that we're going to go to $14 million under adequacy. So we're living here in New Jersey suburbia, the #1 state for public education in New Jersey, and we're going to be sitting probably in the next budget $14 million under adequacy for what our kids deserve. And so I'm not quite sure when and how and why our community is going to get riled up enough to say, we're not going to accept that, because we can't toot the horn any longer. We've been doing it for 5 years and nothing, literally nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from our legislators, nothing has changed from the state level, nothing has changed locally. Literally nothing. We got $800,000 in stabilization aid on a pot of $30 million when there's dozens of districts competing for those funds, because a lot of folks are facing the cliff. I talked to an auditor the other night of another district that I'm not going to name. They literally have, they were to the penny on their budget. They have no reserves. This is a school district with 7,000 or 8,000 kids in it. There's a couple districts like that in the state. There's districts that already hit the precipice even more than us. And it all goes back to S2, which we've argued over and over again is built on a shaky formula, because the school funding formula has only been run once. It's been fully funded one time, and it's been almost 2 decades, and they haven't revisited it. They'll form a committee to look at it. That'll take another couple years. Everybody will kick the can so they can get reelected. Meanwhile, our kids pay the price. The kids that come into this district are the ones who are going to pay the price. The teachers in our classroom that instead of having 100 kids, have 5 sections of 30 kids, and are trying to teach 150 students in a high-performing district in the state of New Jersey. It's disgusting. That's where we're at. So these gentlemen are here tonight to talk about some of the options we have. The other piece, the other big chunk that we have that we can even touch is participation fees, which that will probably be in next year's budget. We're not going to consider that for this year's budget. But we have nowhere else to go. There's no dollars large enough for us to stay solvent. Like, this is where we're at. And again, maybe something happens in this year's budget. The governor's budget address will be the fourth, I think, Tuesday or Thursday in February, the last week in February, and we'll get our state aid figures 2 days ahead of that. And maybe, because it's an election year, there'll be money spread around to keep everybody whole. I would hope, right? Like, it's a simple fix. This is what all the institutions that I'm a part of and the boards that I sit on, this is what we're advocating for with our legislative leaders. Keep districts whole at least this year. NJ.com wrote an article on how districts are doing a poor job of spending their COVID funds. It was perhaps the dumbest thing I've ever read, because we've got those expenditures earmarked for maybe next year, because we knew what you have 3 years to spend these dollars, and just because they haven't come flying out of our pocket doesn't mean that they're not accounted for and being spent. So it was misleading, right? And I question how that was floated out. I sat in a government relations meeting last week, and we had legislators questioning the bus driver shortage, that it was still a thing. Hello? Yeah, it's still a thing. Right? And now, and you roll all this into living in a time of hyperinflation with a 2% cap. The 2% cap was put in place, I would argue, not just to curb public school spending. I would argue it was put in place in many cases to bring public schools to their knees, ultimately. Because you cannot forever live within a 2% cap when everything else is going up 5 and 8 and 10%. You have to cut, and it diminishes services. And I've said this before, from 1970 to 2010, the average school budget grew 7%. Now you might say that's outlandish, that's too much. The bottom line is the kids who grew up in that 40-year period had the services that they need. We're doing the exact opposite. In the past decade, what kind of staff have I added? Armed officers, security, additional support for student mental health needs. Not necessarily classroom teachers, all these other things that we're providing. And so that 2% gets thinned out even more and more and more. So I want to put Tim and Ross's presentation in context, and I hope that when the local papers that watch these meetings and record my snippets send this out to everybody. Because that's where we are in Freehold Regional High School District as a result of legislative decisions and the implementation of S2 and what it's done to these communities. And at the end of the day, I'm not quite sure that any of us want any of our children to be one of 150 kids that their teacher has. So there's a little more context, Mr. Boyce.
So I'll say this as to where these transportation change considerations fit into the overall budget development for next school year. Even in its most aggressive form, right? So the hardcore 2.5 miles and the supplemental efficiencies achieved, that still does not solve our problem as we develop this budget for the next school year. Now, we're going to take some measures as far as hazardous routes go, and we're going to have a mechanism for appeal for that. Because that's what makes sense. So we're not going to achieve the maximum savings that's been reflected here today because of some of those. But as we diminish the savings, because we're going to make those considerations, it just shifts difficult decisions to other areas of our operations that affect our community, our school community. The work that's currently underway is a review of our maps and the determination of what are those scenarios that we as a district are going to identify as hazard. Don't across Route 9 type of roads, right? And we're going to bake that into the recommendation, and that will have an impact on the savings as well. So that work is currently underway. The timeline from here on full budget development is state aid is a piece that's a missing piece right now. As Dr. Sampson said, right around where the governor's budget address, state aid is released. Close to that, so we'll have that piece, and there's some other pieces that we need to pull together to come to a final recommendation. A tentative budget will be adopted on March 16th meeting, and the tentative budget is for submission to the county office of the Department of Education, and it's largely a technical review. It is a technical review. They're not making determinations on the decisions we made. There are many budget law compliance issues, and that's their role, is to make sure that all of those compliance requirements are adhered to. So that's it. That's our March meeting, and then finally the adoption of the budget is on April 27th, and we'll coordinate the policy changes associated with the change in transportation services along that way. First reading March, second reading April, so that everything sort of comes together at the same time as we finalize our budget and move into next year. Mr. Bruno.
I'm going to be optimistic, and hopefully somebody listening to us at the State House, maybe we'll get more money, but guys are great. Really great. Great presentation. I wish I could have it back, because there's so many questions I have. Maybe it's just because I think you're all tired, so I'm not asking more questions, but will we see something as a board a month prior? Let's say our budget, we get 1.8 million for the state. Not the greatest, 1.8, we'll take it, right? So, will you show us a
Sure, the board will be briefed all along the way, and ahead of the public hearing on the budget at the end of April, you'll have a report that will give you a lot of answers with an opportunity for us to discuss any questions or comments that you may have along the way. But I'd like to echo Mr. Bruno's comments on the quality of work provided by Ross and Tim. Here I've worked closely with them for several months now, and they have an enormous wealth of experience, so their insight is invaluable. So we look forward to continue to work with you to bring this project to conclusion, but I'm glad that we got Ross and Tim to join us in looking at this and making some important decisions. So thank you, gentlemen, for that.
Before we take we'll go back up to the podium, but I'll just finish my report from here since everybody's seated. Just a couple things. February 23rd is the reconvening of our strategic planning teams. Dr. Hazel has really led that effort, and it's been a terrific. It's great when you first put a plan together, and then over the past decade plus, we've continued to refine those strategic plans and what they look like for based off of really finding more ways to incorporate student voice into those plans itself. And we've run an awful lot of focus groups, and I'm excited for the 23rd to bring everybody back together, and then we'll be ready to launch that final version in March as well. There's also an item on the agenda this evening to adjust the calendar for state testing. They gave us the state testing days. We've worked around to the best of our abilities to implement that testing. It's not the ideal schedule we would want. We're held hostage a bit by what our busing constraints are, and so that's what the schedule ends up being. And then the last piece that I'll say, and it's just going to echo some of the budget difficulties a bit. I do not begrudge any opportunity that any student has, period. And the Monmouth County vocationals are a wonderful opportunity for students in this area. I do not believe that the legislative intent there was to have one district artificially subsidize the entire system at the expense of the county. And that's what's starting to happen with us. As their application processes are blind, we have over 600 students enrolled in the county vocational. It's not even close with any other district in terms of what those numbers are. If you look at some of the biotech and high-tech high schools, 40 and 50% of those students are freehold regional students. We pay for transportation, we pay tuition. Some of those rates went up 5% this year, even though we're within a 2% cap. We also need legislative relief when it comes to that. It was never intended to fall on one district to artificially keep afloat another school system. And that's what's happening with the acceptance processes at the county vocationals. And when you look at the transportation costs that we absorb from that, so those routes are 6 times more expensive than our own routes. 6 times. They're running at around 35% capacity because of the disparate and the scattershot nature of where kids are picked up from. That is also having an inordinate impact on this district. And I've brought this up to the county commissioners time and time again over the past decade about the funding mechanisms, about relief for this district, about putting some sort of percentage. If it's a county system, it should represent the county. No one high school should be 50% freehold regional kids, because we certainly aren't 50% of the county, right? These are the types of things that need to continue to be advocated for. And it's not about diminishing any student opportunity. It's about funding it in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact this system and the kids in this system. So that concludes my report. Go ahead, Ms. Lavin.
I just want to emphasize too, the parents have to be made aware, because I've been talking about this for years, that you may go to the county, but they want them involved in our athletics, our clubs, our activities, and they're upset because our buses can't get them back to whatever they're sending to school is on time. But they have to make that decision.
Yeah, folks make decisions. Yep.
They have to make the decision before. They want their kids to have more of a complete education.
In other words, we have all those programs. We have missed about those programs.
We have to have decided.
Well, there are duplicative programs, and the original intent of those systems were to have individual and different programs, and not to duplicate in-district programs. But there are a number that are duplicated. And you know, look, Mr. Comegno and Mr. Toscano know that I've certainly asked for legal guidance on what we can do. You know, the law is very clear. There was a similar situation in Union years ago, and the vocational system prevailed. But I don't think the way that it's fallen out in Monmouth, it's the only thing similar to it is in Bergen County. But I don't think there's any one district that's as impacted as ours is in terms of the percentages of some of these particularly higher end high schools. And what that then impact looks on what our spend is as a result to fund it. So we can convene to the table, Mr. President.
Okay. Let's go. Yes. Let's do this. I saw Dr. Shelley. Yeah. Okay. That was very interesting. Nice job. Yeah. Okay, we're going to go right into our board reports. We're going to start with finance. Mr. Messenger, do you have a couple of things to say about finance?
The only presentation we had and discussed was a little more in-depth presentation that this whole board just had. So I have nothing to report.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go right into policy. Right,
Thank you.
Mr. Parisi, right into policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I was at finance with Mr. Messenger, and we got the same presentation, basically. So this year I am serving on policy in addition to finance, and have the opportunity to give my first policy committee report. We met on Tuesday, January 17th to review and discuss several policies and regulations. 2 policies will be abolished. Policy 1681.11, the road forward COVID-19 health and safety, will be abolished, as the New Jersey Department of Education has not released any recommendations or requirements regarding COVID-19 protocols for the 2022-23 school year. Policy 1648.13, school employee vaccination requirements will be abolished. On August 15th, 2022, the governor issued Executive Order 302, which rescinded the requirements requiring schools to adopt a policy that required workers to either provide adequate proof that they would have been fully vaccinated or submit to COVID-19 tests. That concludes the 2 policies that will be abolished. Thank you. I don't think we've ever done that.
He's so happy because it was short.
Mr. Parisi, you did the first policy committee update to
Nobody clapped. Yeah. Nobody clapped for me to use like this. Okay. Thank you.
Diana used to do this report. She said she's jealous.
Yeah, nobody did it for me when I did the report. All right, well,
All right,
thank you.
I have more. There's more.
Okay, go ahead.
There's more. The following policies will be adopted. Policy 3211, Code of Ethics, will be adopted. This policy outlines the board's support of the Code of Ethics for professional educators, published by the National Education Association. Policies 3211.3 and 4211.3, consulting outside of the district, will be adopted. This policy establishes that any teachers / support staff members working outside of district responsibilities shall do so on their own free time, not district paid time. Policies 3282 and 4282, use of social networking sites, will be adopted. This policy outlines the guidelines for any teachers / support staff members on what is appropriate or not on social networking sites. The Freehold Regional High School District Administrators and Policy Committee are in the process of reviewing our older dated policies in following policies, policy 2210, curriculum development, policy 2230, course guides, policy 2330, homework, policy 2416, programs for pregnant students, policy 2510, adoption of textbooks, policy 4140, termination, and policy 5710, student grievance, have minor revisions. I will continue. Policy 0152, board officers, has been revised to memorialize our current practice of electing board officers. Policy 0161, call, adjournment, and cancellation, has minor revisions to provide additional details regarding the process for calling a special meeting. Policy 0162, notice of board meetings, has been revised to provide additional details regarding notice of board meetings. Policy 2423, bilingual and ESL education, has been revised to reflect revisions, including the addition of a statewide English language proficiency assessment for students, a revision to the definition of, quote, native language, end quote, and a requirement of school districts to administer the statewide home language survey to determine which students have a native language other than English. Policy 5200, attendance, has been revised to include recent revisions in administrative code regarding the school register and student excused absences. I'm almost done. Policy 8140, student enrollment, has been revised to reflect the changes in the administrative code. It has been revised revised to include the newly created definition, quote, days in membership, end quote, that was added to replace the definition for, quote, average daily attendance, end quote. The equation for calculating average daily attendance has been removed. Policy 8330, student records, has minor revisions, with most of the changes being citation and language updates. And regulations 8420.2 bomb threats and 8420.7 lockdown procedures and 8420.10 active shooter are revised to remove procedures from the public domain, as those details are already contained within the district's crisis plan. Did everyone get all? Okay, I am done. Thank you,
All right.
Mr. President.
Now I'll clap. Okay. Thank you. May I have a motion to approve E3?
Motion.
May I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion, members? Not hearing discussion, roll call?
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mrs. Cappiello,
Yes.
Mrs. Spinelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley.
Yes, this was just policies, right, not G?
This is just E.
Right, that's what,
Just E.
yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Ms. McCobb,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes. Public participation tonight, nobody signed up to speak. Mr. Boyce, are there any changes to the agenda you'd like to note?
There's a yellow paper in the back with amendments to items G2, G3, G13, J11. Those are changes to the pre-printed agenda, and also, if I could ask Mr. Comegno for one additional item that we need to add.
Thank you, Mr. Boyce. Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to add J also educational programs. Resolve to approve HIB investigative findings and deny appeals in HIB report CN 22-23-09.
That's in J.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. We're under G now, personnel and negotiations. Can I have a motion to approve G1 through G13?
Second.
Mrs. Higley, second. Any discussion? Not hearing any discussion, roll call, please.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mrs. Cappiello,
Yes.
Mrs. Spinelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes, but abstain on G7 as it pertains to Chris Provo, and G9 for Alicia Celso and Dennis Philpott.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Ms. McCobb,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes. Then we're going to take H&I, programmed operations, buildings, transportations, and our physical plan. Can I have a motion to approve H1 through I7?
Move.
Mrs. Cappiello,
I'll second.
Mr. Parisi, second. Any discussion, board? Not hearing any discussion, roll call.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mrs. Cappiello,
Yes.
Mrs. Spinelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Ms. McCobb,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger,
Yes.
Mr. Bruno.
Yes. Moving along to educational programs and administration. May I have a motion to approve J1 through K4?
Motion.
Second.
Sorry, the motion was,
Second.
Diane.
Go ahead.
Diane?
Yeah.
Any discussion? Not hearing any discussion. Roll call, please.
Mrs. Bruno,
Yes.
Mrs. Cappiello,
Yes on everything except on K1, I abstain from Dr. Sampson.
Mrs. Spinelli,
Yes.
Mrs. Higley,
Yes, except J8 to Carol Krachewski, J13 to Angelique Gautier, K1 to Dr. Sampson and Adam Casati and Stanley.
Mrs. Lavin,
Yes.
Ms. McCobb,
Yes.
Mr. Parisi,
Yes.
Mr. Messinger?
Yes.
Mr. Bruno?
Yes. Any board members like to discuss old business? Old business, anyone? Well, this could be old or new, but I want to thank Mr. Parisi for his 2 years of service as vice president. Thank you for your 2 years of service.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're amazing. I'm surprised you're still up. Okay. Any new business? Any board member like to discuss new business?
I would. This past weekend was the OSA Future Health Professionals Regional Conference held at Cumberland County Vocational School District. And we had several Freehold High School competitors who placed in that competition. So Ariana Maney placed 8th in pharmacology. And then Heather Cardudo and Siddhana Sabramian placed 4th in the EMT competition and will be participating in or eligible for the state competition happening in the middle of March. I believe that's March 18th and 19th. And first place, tied for 3rd place in nursing assisting was Claire Kim, also eligible for the state competition. And first place in nursing assisting was Isabella Brettillo. So I just wanted to mention those students.
Thank you.
One item.
Dr. Sampson has a business?
I just want to congratulate Brian Simpson. Brian, where are you out there? Stand up. So Brian, longtime teacher at Freehold High School, that became a teacher coach for us, and for the past few years has been a supervisor of, amongst other things, English and the culinary program and some other things at Borough that were thrown his way. He's done a tremendous job. He's being approved as an administrative supervisor in the curriculum instruction office. We finally filled that position after waiting on it until we found the right person, and we're happy to introduce Brian into that role. So congrats, Brian.
Congratulations. Okay, so can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Mrs. Capiello, second?